different highlight now.
Welcome and good afternoon. Great to see you all here. People are still streaming in. I'm David Barsamian of Alternative Radio, alternativeradio.org. And our panel today is entitled From Billionaires to Big Media, Democracy Up for Grabs. And I can hardly think of two better people in the country than our guests this afternoon, Bob McChesney and John Nichols. You can read their biography, which is quite long, in the program. Just want to point out that Bob, who's on my far left, politically as well as physically, I'm very conservative, is making available, wow, this is like a treat. Christmas is coming early, or Hanukkah, or Kwanzaa, a free copy of his brand new book, Digital Disconnect. I believe they're out somewhere in the lobby.
Out there, yeah. You're all entitled to it, so take one.
It's a terrific book, so be sure to get your copy. Well, the tape is rolling, so let's get into it. I'm going to start with actually the conclusion of the new McChesney-Nichols book, Dollarcracy, which is not yet available. I cannot hold up a copy hot off the press, but will soon be hot off the press. The book actually concludes with, the favored few have reasserted themselves via their courts and their fortunes and their political connections. They have forged a dollarocracy that serves their interests, but that very dollarocracy strangles the will of the people and the forward progress of a great nation. The time has come, finally, for citizens to burst the chains and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. The time has come, finally, in this great reform movement to heed the signal of America's founding, to speak Walt Whitman's password primeval, to give the sign of democracy. John?
Yeah?
Dollarcracy.
All right. Wow. We reference Whitman a lot in the book, as well as Jefferson and Madison and the other founders, and people throughout the American experiment, because our belief is that the American experiment, often criticized for its failings, is at its best an arc of history. Something King would reference that, and others. And that in that arc of history, there's been a great struggle toward democracy, toward an opening up of the process, where at the founding of the Republic, you had maybe someplace in the range of 4 to 8% of Americans allowed to vote, meaning overwhelmingly 9 out of 10 people in any place weren't allowed to vote. Women weren't allowed to vote. People of color weren't allowed to vote. White men who didn't own land weren't allowed to vote. So it was a very tiny base of electoral participation. And over time, it's expanded. And that's been it's a wondrous thing. It is a progress that is worthy of not just embrace, but excitement. And what troubles us is that as we've finally, after 200 years, come to a point where our democracy has been expanded to a level where there is the potential for broad participation, we have a countering of that potential coming from what the progressive reformers of a century ago referred to as the money power. And the money power was the great target of the progressives. The progressives said, look, we have to decrease the role of the robber barons. We have to decrease the role of the very, very wealthy in defining what an issue is, what our discourse should be about, how our country should operate, so that everyone has a place at this table. Let's bring women to the table. Let's give women the right to vote. Let's bring people of color to the table. Let's make sure that their voting rights are protected. Let's expand it even to young people, to say 18 to 21-year-olds. Let's do all these things. But as they did that, there was an assumption that it would have great meaning, and I think it has, but now we see this reassertion of the money power that they feared. And how does the money power reassert itself? The important thing to understand is that many people see this as a campaign finance reform issue. In Dollarocracy, we don't suggest that a Dollarocracy exists simply because people spend a lot of money on campaigns. What we think is that as we've seen a decline of journalism, as we've seen less and less journalism in America, less and less coverage of campaigns with the idea of giving people real information about it, immense amount of commentary on campaigns, mind you, immense amount of commentary on campaigns, but less and less actual coverage of it, a void has been created, and that void has been filled increasingly by campaign ads. And to the point where we write in the book about how some television stations last year during the 2012 cycle shaved minutes off their local newscasts so they could fit more campaign ads in. And what we suggest is that you end up in a situation that's a very unsettling one. And that is, with a diminished journalism and a dramatically increased pressure on our politics, not just in campaigns, but throughout it, from money buying its way in, you end up in a situation where zombie ideas walk among us. And you say, well, what's a zombie idea? Well, there are ideas that have been beaten again and again and again, and yet they are reasserted, and they come marching right into the politics. And you say to yourself, well, what is the point of an election if we send a very powerful signal, if we indicate what we want, and yet the zombie idea comes walking right back into the process? And our argument is that in a dollarocracy, that's what happens, that the dollar never gets beat. It may not prevail at every election, but that it always comes back, and slowly it shapes the discourse. In our view, it has shaped the discourse further and further toward the right. So that in the United States, we end up in a situation where even after people vote to keep Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, to say we don't want to have these things cut, they end up, immediately afterward having a discussion about how we're going to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And you're like, well, how did that happen? What's going on here? And it's our argument in the book, and tweaked out at much deeper level, obviously. But our argument in the book is that so many things have begun to fall apart, that our journalism we have less and less journalism that actually seeks to cover campaigns. We have more and more money. We have so many attempts to game the process. We have overt voter suppression, but we also have, a voter suppression that we think is just as significant, and that is negative ads. Negative ads aren't put on TV to get you to vote for the candidate who paid for the negative ad or for the candidate that the negative ad is supporting. They're put on TV to get you not to vote or to kind of give up on the process. And so we see a situation where at every turn the money has flowed into our process. It defines it in too many ways. And while we're not certain that we've kind of tumbled to that point of pure dollarocracy, we do suggest in the book that we are moving in a direction that creates a circumstance that's very, very dysfunctional for democracy. And I'll close just with this notion that it is not merely dysfunctional for the left or for Democrats. It is very, very deeply dysfunctional for the right and for conservatives. And this is one of the things we write about a lot in the book. We talk to an awful lot of conservatives who are deeply frustrated with a political process that seems to have equated the conservative movement with Wall Street. To say that somebody who is a social conservative or really has a set of values that are rooted in an ideology, and yet again and again they're saying, well, how does that ideology connect to privatization of Social Security, right? And we actually saw it played out, and some people on the left made fun of this, where you'd have these town hall meetings where a congressman was there and somebody'd say, I don't want the government messing with my Medicare. And you say, oh, but you see, there's something deeper in that. There are an awful lot of conservatives who don't want Medicare undermined. And the question is, why would that be a conservative ideal, right? Well, our argument is that the dollarocracy has not just warped, it doesn't just warp democracy as a whole, it warps ideologies within it. And it makes them into things that that are neither pure nor functional. And so if we want to get toward a real democracy in America, and someplace where we have a great debate, and where people who believe strongly can come into that debate and air their ideas, and this battle of ideas actually produces results and solutions, we've got to begin to address the dollarocracy, and with an eye toward developing a democracy.
Let me just add one word to that.
Yeah, Bob, just a second. Before Bob comments, cards, I believe, were handed out, and hopefully there'll be time at the end of the presentations to get to some of your questions.
Yeah, I think your original question was, dollarocracy, question mark. And this is a book John and I have been working on. We've been talking about this book as long as we've known each other. I've been writing, some of my writings I've written about the underappreciated role of bad journalism in our campaign situation. And we have had for a long time the paradox that news media corporations make a fortune selling the sewage of political advertising that we're forced to trudge through. At the same time, the same companies that are making a fortune off this are lowballing their journalism, making it worse and worse to the point where it's non-existent now. So we have these companies that benefit on the public airways making a fortune selling these political ads, then also not doing any journalism, which is the #1 public interest or public service requirement of getting their broadcast license in the first place. So this has always been something John and I have been talking about and wanting to write about. And I think after the Citizens United decision in the 2010 election, we realized the time has come. This is a book that needs to be written. And the idea of dollarocracy, we assume everyone gets it, but it's worth repeating. Instead of a democracy, government of the people, it's the government of dollars. Instead of one person, one vote, it's $1, one vote. So the people with the most money have the most votes, they win. In a society as deeply inegalitarian as the United States, where you have a handful of people with lots of dollars, they run the government and they control the policies to make sure they keep most of the dollars and no one else gets access to the dollars. It's a pretty simple system. And I think also the other contextual point worth making right now is that America is not a reactionary country. It is not a right-wing country. It is not even remotely close to that. And I think the polling survey, when you actually ask questions, they're stripped away of sort of the labels that were given. And just actually, what do you think about Medicare, Social Security, public education, military spending, spying on individuals, civil liberties? America is a remarkably progressive country. And David, I'd say more progressive than any time in a generation or two, if not longer. And the great contradiction in our society is that this is a much more progressive country than our political system can countenance. Our political system is totally wrapped up in dollars. It's completely controlled by corrupt special interests. And they're pursuing policies that are inimical to the interests of the people of the country. We don't want them. We feel powerless and frustrated to use the political system to address our concerns. And so the tension is between dollarocracy and democracy. And it's grown worse because the American people are much further away from the consensus opinions in Washington now than they've been for a long time. They're much more progressive. And I think when viewed that way, what this puts in, I think, into sharp relief these absurd and obscene and outrageous efforts at voter suppression. And these are absolutely part of the dollarocracy process, because I think the people who own this country and who dominate governance in both parties, but they own one completely outright, they own the other one as a subsidiary. These interests know that if their policies are subjected to a voter turnout rate like most countries in the world have, of 65, 70, 75%, the politics of this country dramatically to the left of where they are. We have a very low voter turnout rate, and the lower it goes, the better for the Dollarcrats. And so if they can't get you home by beating you over the head with negative ads, then they're going to pull out the heavy artillery, and they're going to make it harder to vote, harder to register to vote, make you wait in line for 6 hours to vote. They do everything in their power to limit your ability to vote. And so this is actually a very hopeful book, because if I thought the vast majority of Americans were on the side of the Dollarcrats, I'd be pretty depressed. I'd say, well, but they wouldn't have to do this stuff then. They understand what we should all understand. This is basically a progressive country. It's waiting there to be galvanized to move forward. The great problem we have is this incredibly corrupt system, locked in by big money, locked in by Citizens United, reinforced by a horrible news media that do a dreadful job of covering elections. What little coverage remains, and I would only disagree with my beloved comrade in one point. He says there's lots of talk about elections. There's really lots of talk about presidential elections and a handful of congressional elections, but there's not even gossip about other elections anymore. They simply disappear. Not to mention any sort of real coverage of any election off below the ticket once you get below the congressional or statewide level. You know, they're unknown. You're voting for strangers, the names that mean nothing. You might as well be voting for Social Security numbers. You know nothing about these people, basically. And so this is the great crisis we're trying to address of dollarocracy and the campaign to reverse it. And it's a campaign I think we can reverse. We go into great detail in the book. And I do want to emphasize for those who straggled in late, it's not this book. This is a different book.
Although that book makes a fine holiday gift.
Well, it's free. You don't have to sell it. It's free up to the front counter. But the point is, John and I have been working on this book for a long time. This one sort of came up in the middle while John was writing his stuff on the Wisconsin uprising. And but in our view, this book is a multi-layered book. We've barely touched the surface of it, and I'll turn it over to Brother Barsamian to dig away.
Well, this has been described as a democracy deficit, and let's talk more about that, how to overcome that. But going back to the founding fathers, or the founding finaglers, as some have called them, they kind of laid the groundwork for the system today. I mean, you had someone like Madison saying that the role of government is to protect the opulent minority against the majority. And then his comrade, John Jay, went one step further. He said, those who own the country ought to govern it. And that's pretty much been the system since the founding of the country.
Well, let me suggest to you that at every point in the history of the United States, there's been what Robert M. La Follette, the great Wisconsin progressive of the early part of the 20th century, referred to as the old struggle. And La Follette, when I went to La Follette's house a couple of years ago, they were selling it, and they were selling off the remains of his books.
It was being foreclosed?
No, yeah. It's the one that it was actually, I think that his grandson had decided to move on to smaller digs. But they were selling off his books, and it was a fascinating collection of books. It was mostly Jefferson and Madison and Emerson and Whitman and a lot of American writers throughout history. And the fascinating thing about what La Follette referred to as the old struggle was an argument that if we actually taught history in the United States, we would know. And that is that at the beginning of the United States, there was a great struggle, right? There were people who really did take different positions. I'm a Paineite. I'm on the side of Tom Paine. And I deal in a lot of history, and so I actually have favorites in that era. And the fact of the matter is that you can find a quote from Madison that will frustrate you and sound very anti-democratic or unappealing, but you can also find a quote from Madison that will say something very different, because these guys actually wrote a lot, and they expressed a lot of different opinions in a lot of different contexts. But I go to the Martin Luther King Jr. concept on this, and King talked about this a lot. They said to him, well, how can you reconcile yourself with Jefferson and with some of these other founders who owned slaves? And King said, look, history is of people improving, of people moving forward, of aspiring to things. And what Thomas Jefferson and others gave us at the founding of the American experiment was an outline, some ideals, some very, very well-spoken statements about all created equal. And we've tried to fill that in. We've tried to make this country move in that direction, and there are always people that pull in the other direction. And here's where the frustration comes at this point in our history. I think we have a great consensus in this country, a wide majority of Americans who have pretty much reconciled themselves to a vision of how they would like the country to operate. We are not a divided nation. We're not a deeply divided nation. In fact, there was just a poll out the other day, a great poll. They asked people, would you prefer to have investment by the government in job growth or a focus on deficit reduction, right? And job growth, investment in job growth, stimulus, won overwhelmingly, hugely, among Democrats, among independents, and narrowly, it actually did very well among Republicans. And the fact of the matter is, people are not fools. They actually know that you can't cut yourself to prosperity. And yet, we have this fantastical, bizarre notion that is inserted into our politics. And that's what we get to with dollarocracy is about more than just maybe wealthy people defining things, because there's wealthy people on the left and the right, you know? It is really about a handful of people defining the debate so narrowly and so dysfunctionally that they make democracy seem meaningless, or at least make it seem like something that just, it's like a Groundhog's Day situation. You know, you wake up every morning, you're still fighting the old fight, and you're wondering to yourself, you know, why do we keep at this old, why doesn't it move forward? And one of the arguments we make in the book is that there are structural challenges now that have developed over the last 100 years. And what we have to do is address those structural challenges. And the way in which to do that is not to simply focus on standard electoral politics, to say Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, things like that, but to recognize that the goal of the great mass of Americans, to our view, ought to be to develop a politics that provides a real reflection of where people are at. And the best way to do that is to reduce the influence of the dollar and increase the influence of the vote, right? And so we want dramatically higher turnout. We would like to have the dollar buy its way in a lot less, have the vote mean much. And so what we conclude in the book, and this is to give away this, you know, the last chapter, is that there are many people pushing for reform right now from a lot of different directions. And it's often, you know, it's like, which reform do you want to back, right? Media reform, campaign finance reform, voting right, you know, all these different things. We argue that a great beginning point for all of this is an amendment to the Constitution of the United States that guarantees the right to vote and the right to have that vote counted. The most simple of concepts. And we wouldn't be smart enough to come up with this on our own. Our friend Antonin Scalia, during the Bush v. Gore deliberations, you know, pointed out that there is no constitutionally protected right to vote. And in fact, that is the case. And so one of the things that we argue in the book at some length is that this is what, if we're going to challenge a dollarocracy on behalf of democracy, what we ought to do is have a place which we organize around and where we kind of go to a core concept. Doesn't mean that all the other reforms aren't sought, but go to a core concept. And it is our view that the great beginning point to go state by state, member of Congress by member of Congress, and really fight is for a guaranteed right to vote for all Americans and a right to have that vote counted. We think that in opening that discussion, we begin to open up a much broader dialogue. You know, if we've got the right to vote, then how do we make sure that vote has real meaning in a democracy? And we think that all of the additional reforms about how you have an informed electorate, how you have fair elections, begin to extend from that. So our argument is that a return to basics and then an extension from them is really the way to go.
Well, if the goddess wanted us to vote, she would have given us candidates. You know, the supposition there is that, you know, we've got these fantastic candidates out there, wonderful political parties, but they're being corrupted by the flow of dollars into their coffers. But isn't this the logic of capitalism? I mean, Bob, your work in Monthly Review with John Bellamy Foster, you know, is required reading, and you talk about the capitalist economic system and what it generates, and this is part of that.
Yeah, and I do in this book at some length too, Digital Disconnect. Well, our argument isn't that there are great candidates out there that people don't know about, they should be voting for them, but rather is that once you build the critical mass of people who might vote, it would give the leverage for people to organize for better candidates and have a better chance of success. It doesn't guarantee victory, but it's mandatory for victory, at least at the electoral level. Nor is our argument that electoral work's the only thing people should do, that that's the sole place where you work on political activism. I think the lessons of history, and including very recent history, are that as the electoral system gets more and more corrupt and dysfunctional, as it currently is in the United States, it increases the importance of demonstrations, strikes, other sorts of mechanisms to get the attention of those in power and to rally those out of power. And it gets attention, and it's very important for that reason. So I don't think our argument's predicated on the idea that there is great parties out there for people to vote for, but it's mandatory precondition to move where we want to go, that everyone have the right to vote and then not be screwed around with by all these governments.
I don't know if we have enough time in terms of a constitutional amendment. Might you suggest something with a little more alacrity, something that we could do in the coming period? I mean, it takes forever to get a constitutional amendment passed.
Actually, no, it doesn't. That's
Almost
the funny
forever.
thing about it. This is one of the most interesting things about discussions of the Constitution. We forget how many times we've amended the Constitution. It's dozens of times. The fact of the matter is that our Constitution has been updated on a regular basis, starting at the very beginning of the Republic. James Madison, who you referenced, ran a great campaign against James Monroe in a congressional district in Virginia on the question of how are we going to get this Constitution to where it needs to be. And Madison arrived up in New York they were meeting on Wall Street, and introduced a set of amendments to the Constitution. So the founders themselves recognized the value of amending the Constitution, and it has been steadily amended throughout history. And this is one of the things we talk about in the book. Why we don't dismiss the Constitution, but we actually see it as an organizing tool. And our friends on the right have as well. The people who introduced a right to life amendment 40 years ago and began proposing that, they didn't get their right to life amendment, but I would suggest you will hear from folks that efforts to diminish women's access to reproductive rights they've advanced pretty far. So sometimes you put an amendment out there knowing that you may not get there quickly, but that it becomes a tool around which we discuss. And I'll just put one element in on constitutional amendments. I always tell people to think of it this way. In 1910, in the United States of America, women did not have the right to vote. The people did not have the right to tax the rich. And we couldn't elect our U.S. senators. They were appointed by, usually often in backroom deals, very corrupt circumstances. By 1920, actually, by 1915, we had established an income tax. We had created an elected Senate, and by 1920, we had women with the right to vote. And so in relatively rapid periods in history, we have made a wide range of reforms that address the crisis. And what I would suggest to you is that one of the great challenges of people who want to make American democracy work is that there has been an immense amount of energy that has gone into tinkering around the edges and saying, maybe we'll try this here or we'll try that there. When we are failing to recognize the wisdom of people of previous generations, that when you have a lot of challenges, you take on big efforts and you make big changes with an eye toward fixing things. And what we suggest in the book is that there are ages of reform in American history, points where a lot of change occurs very, very rapidly. And in all of those ages of reform, there's a lot of constitutional amendments that come forward. They aren't all enacted, but many of them are. And it's another good example, just to give you, in the early 1960s, the poll tax still existed. People 18 to 21 could be sent off to war without having a vote as regards that war. We had some other structural challenges with presidential succession, things like that. Between early 1960s, early 1970s, we did 3 amendments to we amended the Constitution. We had proposals for a number of other amendments to the Constitution. And in the midst of that, we did a Civil Rights Act, a Voting Rights Act, Medicare and Medicaid. And so the fact of the matter is, I think we've set our goals very, very low. And the crisis, to my mind, is very, very big. And so what we argue in this book is that it's time to think much bigger about how to do fundamental reforms with a small d democracy goal to those reforms. It doesn't exclude all sorts of legislative initiatives. It doesn't exclude many, many different approaches to do it. But we shouldn't be cautious about this. And we, again, should not be cautious about thinking this is a narrow struggle. The fact of the matter is, there are people on the right, in the middle, and on the left in this country who recognize that American democracy is not working well for them. And there are possibilities to build incredibly broad and exciting coalitions that aim toward big goals in the future, but then, once built, can achieve significant progress at the local and state levels in the immediate moment.
Well, in your view, did the Occupy movement address some of these issues?
Certainly. I think the Occupy movement was, I think, I doubt there would be much debate in this room, at least I would hope not, was a very welcome breath of fresh air. I'd like to see the gale force increase quite a bit going forward. So it's the direction we have to go, something like that, more work, grassroots activism. I'd like to add a couple things, though, and this is the crucial point John was making. We're in very serious trouble in this country, in our political system and our economy. We have tremendous growing inequality. We have out-of-control, unchecked militarism. And we all know the issues. They're very bad. And we have a political system that's incapable of reflecting right now the will of the people, as far as we can tell. It's completely, whatever we want, it doesn't matter who gets elected. Something else is going to happen when there's powerful interests who want it on the crucial issues, for the most part. That's what we're living with. And we're going to need fundamental changes. We're going to need it. This is not a tinkering era we're entering. If we're going to solve these problems, it's going to require stuff that, like Occupy was saying, dramatic changes that really reshuffle the deck of how Americans' political economy works. And if it's going to be that, that's going to mean it's going to be fought on a whole lot of issues. And it's also almost certainly going to involve constitutional amendments, because that's the record of American history. When you have periods of turbulence, constitutional amendments are part of the picture. That's the way you crystallize your victories, you change things, and you force things to stay on that path. So I think that's the argument. If we don't have any constitutional amendments in the next 10 or 20 years, history suggests 10 or 20 years from now, we're all going to be really depressed. We're going to have the 19th Media Reform Conference saying, damn, when's this changing? And we don't want that. Now, the other point, just to follow up on John's point, is the ERA is a good example on the left. The Equal Rights Amendment is not passed, but unquestionably we've had tremendous victories for women short of an amendment that came, a lot of it, from the organizing politically that was launched by the campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment. And it's had lots of spin-off that's been positive. So even if you don't win, the organizing that goes to it can really contribute to it. And David, I want to respond to you because John got a chance to. I hear this a lot about, well, the founders are a bunch of schmucks. They owned all the property. Don't we have what today pretty much what they wanted? This was their world. They wanted the Koch brothers and these corporations to run everything. And Rupert Murdoch. This is pretty much in their DNA. So what are you whining about? Look at what their quotes they said. And I agree with John here. I mean, as I study American history, you can read that into it, but we can also read a lot of other things too. It's a very complex issue. It's one of struggle. And it hasn't always been that the other guys have won. It's also been great victories along the way. Right now, unfortunately, we're on a losing streak in a certain way. But, if you were to take a Mount Rushmore in 1787, so let's build Mount Rushmore, take the three most important Americans in 1787, the people that hundreds of thousands of Americans are willing to die for to create freedom for this country. Who would the three people they'd put up there be? It wouldn't be John Jay. It wouldn't be James Madison. It wouldn't be some banker in New York. It would have maybe been George Washington, the general, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Paine. There's no question Thomas Paine's in the first three. And Thomas Paine's a goddamn leftist. He's a socialist. That's the person who got people to fight for this country to be free. They didn't get up to fight for John Jay. They fought for Tom Paine. And why are we going to let the right wing claim it's their country? Because John Jay said it's their country. Tom Paine said it's our country. Let's fight for that country.
Let me just throw one element in on that. This is a media reform conference. We talk a lot about media. A lot of this conversation has gone to these broader components. One of the things that we do in the book is we argue that a part of the current crisis is opportunities missed along the way. And one of the reasons that you have to have an age of reform where you demand really big responses to challenges is because you missed opportunities along the way. And I think one of my favorite parts of the book actually is the section where we talk about when Lyndon Johnson was president of the United States in the 1960s, after they had done the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, in 1967, Johnson put forward a campaign finance reform bill, almost lost to history, that was a quite remarkable document that included funding for third parties and small independent politics. It was really quite a serious effort because they had just done civil rights and voting rights, they said, we're actually expanding the electorate now. Let's see if we can make sure that we have elections that have a range of voices and a real discourse in them. And that legislation, unfortunately, as with so many things in the later period of Lyndon Johnson's presidency, disappeared into the void of the Vietnam War and many of the other problems. The other thing that they proposed at that time, and that Johnson and Bill Moyers talked about, was an American BBC. And the idea that we would create a public broadcasting system in this country with sufficient resources and sufficient funding for independent media in this country that it could sustain a real democracy, that we would have a full range of voices, many competing ideas out there. And we go back and look at these ideas not to say that, boy, what a bummer we didn't get it, but to say that throughout our history there come points where good ideas come forward, where necessary reforms should be made. When we miss those opportunities, they come back to haunt us. A failure to act is often as damaging as something any enemy of yours does or anybody you're competing with. And so our argument is that throughout the history of the United States, going back to the founding, there have been great ideas and great visions for how to make this democracy whole and real and functional and responsive to the great mass of Americans. And we think that in the 21st century, we have enough knowledge, we have enough skills, we have enough technology to create media systems and political systems that really are responsive to what the great mass of citizens and the great mass of people want in this country. And it is absurd for us to talk about tinkering around the edges when it is possible finally to make real the promise of the American experiment.
Well, the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 was, in fact, the last piece of Great Society legislation that LBJ was able to push through. And in it, it lifted almost verbatim from the Carnegie Commission report from a few years later, which said that this broadcasting system, radio and television in the United States, should be a forum for controversy and debate, and provide voices for those in the community who might otherwise be unheard. So the legislation is there, the ideals are there, and what do we have? We have National Public Radio, Cokie Roberts, and Robert Siegel talking to this and that former general or State Department official, and we have the Petroleum Broadcasting Service, the PBS system, which it's hard to kind of make a parody of that because it is so appallingly bad.
But you like Downton Abbey.
Downtown Abbey, a great picture actually of class warfare. But Bob, you're the media scholar on the panel. We're media workers.
Yeah, well, I think we talk about the 67 Public Broadcasting Act because it's very important. And I think the central issue here for Dollarocracy and for politics is that those countries that don't have a lot of money in their politics, those countries don't rely on billionaires to pay for them, that don't have idiotic commercials, and I shouldn't have to say idiotic by definition. American political advertising is idiotic, but I find them so revolting, I just can't stop myself whenever I talk about them. Those countries that don't enjoy that experience that we get bathed in constantly almost all have a public system that covers politics. They have an alternative. We don't have that alternative here because our public system is so weak in terms of covering politics. They don't have the resources, if not the willingness, to devote to covering campaigns in the way we need, especially at the local level, which is where coverage has all but disappeared. And what was striking to me when we were doing our research for the book, and I don't know if Christina Williams is here as a researcher who worked with me on this in Illinois last year, but what was striking when we looked at the 67 Act, and I didn't know this before, and I doubt you, David, I know you studied this, you did either, but after the 67 Public Broadcasting Act was passed, Congress is dragging its heels and creating this fourth non-commercial network, nonprofit network. And the three commercial networks at the time had no interest in opening up and letting them in. So they were trying to drag it so this network wouldn't get launched for years and years and years. And finally, some people got pissed off, and they started a group called, I think, the National Committee for Public Broadcasting, which was an organizing campaign to force Congress to require this thing to start. They'd already created it. Now put it into effect so we could have a new public broadcasting system in the United States. And what was interesting in studying it was they weren't getting a lot of traction. And then the guy who organized it, a guy named Thomas Hovering, started talking about how bad campaign coverage was in 1968. It's during the presidential election, and how terrible the coverage was of the election, how awful political ads are. And suddenly people are getting really excited. Yeah, let's get this public broadcasting system so we can actually have coverage of politics and elections. And that was 40 years ago. And I'll tell you this, 44 or 45 years ago, our news media coverage in elections looked like a debate team at Oxford and Cambridge compared to what goes on now. I mean, commercial media looks like the League of Women Voters was programming it in 1968 compared to what we saw last year. So, the connection there between having nonprofit, non-commercial media, well-funded, and having quality campaign coverage so you don't let billionaires own your elections is an important one in any solution to the crisis of elections and electoral democracy in this country. Has to have a media component. We can pass all the amendments we want. We can pass all the campaign funding limits we want. If we don't have journalism that covers elections effectively and draws us into public life, it won't really amount to a hill of beans. So that's why we emphasize media in the book, in our critique, and in our solutions. And that's the important lesson there, that people got that. I mean, this is not something people don't understand. When people are ever given a choice, hey, would you like to not have political ads? And instead, all the money that we roughly came up with $10 billion spent on the last campaign in 2012. Have all that money go to pay for journalism, or a lot of it to cover the campaign. You can learn about it and not be propaganda. Very few Americans say, no, we really love the ads. Bring it on. We love more ads. They say, no, actually, I wouldn't mind seeing a journalist account of the race and hearing interviews with candidates and seeing real debates, not these bogus press conferences set up by the party central committee that keeps the third parties out.
Well, we're kind of bouncing off each other here, and I want to just say there's such a tendency in these discussions to focus on national politics and presidential politics, and that is frankly what an awfully lot of our media does, because it's very, very easy to do, right? You can talk about these personalities, do I like Mitt Romney more than I like Barack Obama? How good looking is Paul Ryan? And so that, but where we see the crisis is where power really is in America. Most of the power in America is at the local level. It's your school board, it's your city council, it's your county board, your county commission. They're making fundamental decisions that have profound impacts on your lives. And the coverage of these areas, this is where the crisis of democracy becomes most profound. And in the book, we use example after example of communities across the country where important campaigns were not covered, where the decision in the campaign was made almost solely by the ads, who could buy the most ads and who could do the most, creative, media. And the example that we cite quite often is in Illinois in 2010 in the race for lieutenant governor of Illinois. And the Democratic primary was won by a guy who was quite wealthy, and he bought a lot of ads, and he beat, kind of legislators who were perhaps more credible candidates and that, because he had the money to buy the ads. And it turned out immediately after the election that, his rap sheet was quite long. And the background on his treatment of his wife and on many of his other his ex-wife, admittedly, was pretty shocking. Now, this guy was eventually forced to quit as the nominee for lieutenant governor because it was such shocking stuff came out after the election. And we're not the ones saying this. The Chicago newspapers, the columnists wrote, geez, we really should have covered that campaign. Because this is the person one heartbeat away from the governorship of Illinois. And columnists and political commentators in Illinois said, we really blew that one. But what they didn't bring to it, in our view, what they said is, well, we'll try to do better next time, right? Well, the reason that doesn't make it is because it is as we have so diminished the coverage of our local politics, as we have, taken our local newscasts and made them 7 minutes of weather and 7 or 8 minutes of sports and the remainder on crime, we have left very, very little room for a discussion of our small d democratic life. And it is our argument that there need to be interventions at the local, state, and national level to dramatically expand the amount of coverage of our politics. Because I think if we do, we might even have better candidates for lieutenant governor of Illinois.
I noticed you left out the Kardashian sisters from those. They're, of course, required. Ben Badgikian wrote a seminal book in the early 1980s called The Media Monopoly, in which he identified 50 corporations controlling most of the media in this country. That number's down to 5 today. But, this is an inevitable driving force of the capitalist political economy. More and more mergers and more concentration. Are you proposing that this can somehow be broken up or reversed by edicts from the FCC?
No, not actually. I don't buy that it's entirely due to capitalism. Capitalism leads to concentration. I've written a lot about that. But a lot of the concentration in media is corrupt policy making that simply allows people to own a lot of stuff. That if you didn't allow those, you could have it's not like it's mandated by capitalism. It's permitted by corrupt capitalism to allow one company to own newspapers, radio stations, and TV stations in the community. Those media would survive if they were independently owned. So it's not an iron law of economics. It's just corruption. Although capitalism does lead to concentration. That being said, I think what we're arguing in the book, and this goes back to our last book, Death and Life of American Journalism, is a more profound argument. It goes, I think, beyond the idea of just having more owners of media. We're at an impasse now where there's just very little journalism being done in the United States because commercial interests don't find it profitable anymore. They're just not doing as much. If you look at the resources going to journalism today on a per capita basis, they're probably around 40% of what they were 25 years ago, maybe less. I mean, when John and I did our book tour for Death and Life of American Journalism, we went to maybe 24 American cities, including Denver, and invariably in every city we would go in to talk to a veteran newsperson in a newsroom or a dean of a journalism school and we'd say, how many paid reporters or editors are there in your community today, including internet people, the works, today, compared to 1987? What's the difference in number? And the difference was usually half as many, sometimes a lot less. And then once a newspaper closes, it even plummets further.
If I could just add, today the Cleveland Plain Dealer announced more staff cuts. And
what's striking about this, and we developed this in the book as well, is that it's gotten worse in the last 3 years. I mean, it's continued. It's not, they thought that this is a function of the collapse of 2008, but no, unfortunately, it's continued. And I think we face up in the book to what is now, I think, a fairly clear truth. Journalism's a public good. It's something that the market can't produce in sufficient quality or quantity. That relationship was masked for 125 years because advertising gave the illusion that it could be commercially viable. And for 125 years, advertising provided between 50 and 100% of the revenues of all our news media. Now advertising is fleeing not just journalism, but all forms of content. The new form of smart advertising online, advertisers pay for the audience, and they find the audience whatever website they go to. A far less percentage of the money goes to the people who provide the website, so very little of advertising money ends up producing content anymore, journalism or otherwise. Well, that's a social problem for us. If we're counting on the market, rich people to make profits to give us journalism, it's not going to happen. We can see it around us. It's not happening. No one thinks it's happening. Now that John and I were talking just yesterday, someone was saying, hey, we finally figured out a way to break, we're going to charge for our stuff online with a paywall, and we're going to stop the bleeding. All that means is they're just going to lay off a few less people. No one's talking about hiring 500 more journalists as a result of this. It's simply not happening. We have to face up to that. And then the social problem is, how are we going to have coverage of campaigns? If that is a public good. Well, the founders of our country understood that and instituted enormous postal subsidies to spawn a press system that could draw everyday people into public life. We've got to have that same sort of imagination today. We've got to come up with some way to get funding for independent, competitive newsrooms, covering elections, covering communities, or else everything else we do will be meaningless. The framers of this country, who had their flaws, got that one. They got that one really well, and it's a lesson we've forgotten, and we've got to remember it. We've got to remember it fast. We've got to come up with ways to get people covering politics. Now, public media, NPR, public television, community radio, my favorite, and also, but all these things, public access, these are these are existing institutions we have, we should strengthen. But we've got to go way beyond them. We've got to find ways for people working online. We've got these wonderfully talented people. A lot of them are right here at this conference who can't make a dime online. And it's not because they aren't any good. It's because it can't be done. It just can't be done. It's just not going to happen. Advertising's not there. The system isn't going to work. If we want to have journalism, we have to pay for it. And if we want to have good elections, we're going to have journalism. So that's the answer there.
Just to come off that for a sec, Bob referenced the postal subsidies at the founding of the country. Those were, at the founding of the American experiment, the goal was to get a lot of information out to the people. And so it was very, very cheap to send a newspaper to make sure the newspaper got around. And it was postal subsidies and printing subsidies also that made it possible for America to have a flourishing of journalism that the rest of the world came to look at and say, wow, that is an amazing thing that's happening there. We want our countries, reformers in other countries, we want our countries to emulate that great American experiment. It's important to understand, too, how this works, because we're not talking about, some sort of, big brother giant media hovering over America. Quite the opposite. We love the model of the postal subsidies at the founding of the American experiment. And you know what? Some of the first publication, let me put it another way. Some of the first African-American run institutions in the United States to get support from the government were abolitionist newspapers. Newspapers published by free men and even free women that sought to distribute a message, and they went through the mails. And this was an incredible thing. This was a democratizing element in our country. And here's the important thing to understand about it. In the start of the American experiment on the issue of slavery, Congress had an agreement that it didn't debate slavery for the first decades of the American experiment because it was too contentious an issue. And he thought, well, where did the anti-slavery movement come from? Where was it generated? Where did it build from? Well, it built through abolitionist newspapers, through a communication system, and that communication system was sustained and encouraged by the federal government. And it wasn't, it didn't say we pick you over you, we like you over you. No, you have a publication, you can go through the mails at a very low subsidized rate. We think it is possible to bring some of these ideas to the 21st century and to say that there are ways, other countries around the world do this and have ways to provide subsidies, sustenance, support so that media from across the political spectrum, ideas from libertarian to left-wing can be written about and heard, but also that in the midst of that, there can be a lot more core journalism, just core old-fashioned journalism talking about our politics. We think it's possible. These are not kind of pie-in-the-sky ideas. Other countries do it. And one of the things that we did in Death and Life, but we also talk about a good deal in this coming book, is the difference in the support of public and independent media in other countries compared to the United States. And it's massive. It's literally at 75-to-1 ratios, the amount of support that other countries give.
Per capita.
Per capita. And, some of the other countries where you have this very well-sustained public and independent media, do you know who created it? Dwight Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur. Because when the United States was in Japan and Germany after World War II, working very, very hard to try and create democracy to replace totalitarianism, there was a great emphasis placed in those years on sustaining a diverse and competitive independent media with lots of public broadcasting. And it was, if you go back and read the history of it, what you will find is that one of America's great exports to the world has been a well-funded public and independent media. It's an idea that we ought to bring home to America.
One of the chapters in the book is on the internet, and you ask the question, won't social media provide an inexpensive way for people to communicate with each other and undermine the power of big money?
Yeah, that's a chapter that is probably the most original chapter in the book because it was based on developments that took place in 2012 that we didn't anticipate, and I don't think many people did. And I think it's not fully appreciated now, the Obama campaign in 2008 ran a masterful campaign for him to win the election, and what was change you can believe in? Was that the slogan?
Yeah, change.
Change you can believe in. And after the election, the advertising age, I think it was Ad Age, or they held its conference, and they gave the Marketer of the Year award to the Obama campaign for 2008. And I think it just beat out Nike's and Coors to show the competition it was in, where our politics are headed. And what's interesting in 2012, I think in 2012, the Obama campaign did a vastly superior job than 2008. And I think it has set the sort of model for where politics is going for successful candidates going forward. It's already, everyone's studying what they did. Because I mentioned that notion of smart advertising before, where you just go, you find people online and you go to them. And the whole key to that is that you have every bit of information you collect about people online and what they do. And most Americans are unaware of the fact that virtually everything you do online, certainly anything through Facebook or Google, a number of commercial companies, not the least of which are Facebook and Google, know exactly what you do. They have all this information. Now, they generally don't have your name attached to it, but they've got all your demographic information, and they know where you go and how to reach you. Immense amounts of information. And the Obama campaign collected all their data offline and online, put it in one enormous cloud, and then put the best computers in the world slicing and dicing it, and they're able to come up with different messages to different people. And they also attach names to people. And so they really put together this extraordinary, sophisticated way of running a political campaign that is also, by any reckoning, incredibly frightening, because what they can do is they can tell different messages to different people, and you don't know what other people are getting. And you know, there's a great line we use in the book from the famous Daisy ad in 1964, which is a seminal ad when the Doyle Dane Bernbach ad agency in 1964, LBJ is running its Barry Goldwater. And if you haven't seen this ad, and I suspect most of you have if you're over the age of 40 or 50, but even younger, it's this great ad because it was only aired once, and it was an ad where a little girl is counting petals on a flower. When she gets to the end, a nuclear bomb goes off. And then LBJ's voice comes in, and LBJ says, these are the stakes. We either learn to live together as brothers or we're going to die together like idiots. Vote for Johnson. And so it's pretty clear they're saying, if you elect Barry Goldwater, this moron's going to blow up the world because he's a crackpot who loves nuclear weapons. And, you know, it was a brilliant ad. They only had to run it once, but it got the message across and everyone talked about it. And I think it was David Broder, right after the campaign, was talking to the Doyle Dane Bernbach people who put the ad on with the Johnson campaign. And the guy who did the ad said, you know, the one thing that concerns me is that someday someone's going to be able to do an ad for this who's someone whose politics I won't like, who'll be able to manipulate people this effectively, who's a bad guy, not someone who I support. And I think that when you look at that Obama stuff, for especially people who are sympathetic to Obama, you've got to say, well, what would it look like if someone you didn't like was doing this? Someone you didn't like was able to know everything about you, have friends on Facebook, get tips on how to talk to you, what the sales message. They learn enough about our moods. They can have different messages for us based on the moods we have, our personality. It's quite striking. We're just at the beginning of it. But I think by the end of the 2012 election, the line was that the people in Silicon Valley said, you know, for the first, it used to be the politicians followed us. Now we're following them. And so the people who are working on Obama's campaign were the ones who were being recruited by Silicon Valley to come in and show us how you do it, because it was so extraordinary.
I'm going to just one quick sec to underline a point there. It's important to recognize that in the book we do write about digital journalism. We write about people who are doing online journalism, and there's some wonderful people out there working really, really hard and doing terrific work. But the reality is that what we found is we talked to lots of people in the business community, people in the activist community, experts in a lot of different areas, was that the real dynamic developments as regards our digital future, as regards what happens in these phones, was not on the journalism side. It was on taking many of the things that we least like about old media, right? The ads, the targeting, the negative stuff, and bringing it in through your phone now and targeting that. And so what we see is a situation where the hope that the digital age might be incredibly democratizing and it might open up all sorts of possibilities, that does play out in some ways, and we shouldn't diminish that. But there's also an awfully lot going on as regards the use of digital communications that is mainly oriented toward creating a much more intensive pressure on people politically that is not about informing them per se so much as it is about pressuring them either to vote one way or not, or even making them so depressed about the political process that they decide not to vote. And that's something very important to underline. Negative ads are not put up with the purpose of making you say, I was going to vote for that woman, now I'm going to vote for this guy because I saw a negative ad. That's not why those ads are put up. They don't presume you're going to cross the political wilderness. The presumption of most negative ads is that you were going to vote for somebody, we're going to tell you stuff so horrible about that person that you will decide just not to vote. You'll just stand down because you're so horrified by the process. Well, imagine if something you trust, and we tend to trust our phones a great deal, if something you trust in a very sophisticated way is coming to you with an immense amount of information that makes you think who you wanted to support is really a terrible person, and that information coming to you is based on your buying habits online, your reading habits online, so it is targeted specifically to make you decide not to vote for the person you thought you liked. This is stuff we ought to be thinking about, and what's wonderful on this is that we have some grand coalitions developing on the left and the right as regards online privacy, and privacy becomes a component of what we ought to think about as regards how we look at the digital age, especially as regards politics.
All right, let's move along quickly now because we have a slew of questions here, and I think it demonstrates how people are engaged in this issue and care about it. Bob, what countries are good models for subsidizing public independent media?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the traditional countries people point to in this case are the Scandinavian countries that subsidize second, third, fourth newspapers sometimes in communities, so they're diverse voices, and have enormous public broadcasting systems with very effective firewalls so governments in power can't mess with the content if they don't like it.
John, someone is monitoring your work. You said in December that
Excellent.
Good luck with this
so
one.
much money was spent on campaign advertising that minutes were cut from regular programming.
Newscasts,
You referred to that. Well, the question is, can't the FCC enforce regulations?
That's a very good. You're at a conference where we're going to be talking about a lot of that stuff, and this is a very interesting thing. We write about it a lot in the book. We have something in America called battleground states, right? If you don't live in one, you do not have any idea what goes on in American politics. But if you do live in a battleground state, you know that there is this amazing. We had a thing in the book of a guy from from Iowa. He was a TV station sales guy in Iowa, and he was talking about how he would break off from his Christmas dinner or his New Year's Eve meal to go out and reap more money for the ads because it was just coming in, flooding in at such a rate. And this is true. And so what we found is that, in fact, there have been local TV stations, because adjacencies to the news is when you want to put ads on, who've shaved minutes off the newscast so they can fit more political ads around them, because there's this rush of people that want to spend money. And not all the political ads are from candidates. Many are from so-called independent groupings, which you can often get the highest dollar money. So the TV stations love this. Well, this is definitely something that the FCC should be looking at in a major way. We have diminished so much of the public service commitment that you are supposed to make when you get a license for a TV station. And that's definitely something to be looked at. But there's also something else. And Michael Copps, the former FCC commissioner who's here, will be talking at some length about the fact that the FCC actually has rules, that there are existing rules that say that the FCC can require you to identify who pays for ads, right? So that when you see an ad saying horrible things about Mitt Romney, right, and it looks like it's paid for by Americans for Apple Pie, you can identify who paid for it. And similarly, if there's an ad saying horrible things about, your local county commission candidate, you can find out that it isn't actually Americans for, prosperous tomorrows on top of the mountaintop, but, the guy who wants a zoning change in the county so that he can end up, owning everything. And so the FCC has a lot of power. It is not using its authority to protect the public interest in this regard.
This is such an important point. Let me add to this, because this even worse than the first part John said is really the crucial one. The FCC cannot regulate the content of political ads. That's protected speech. It's political speech. But it's important to understand the FCC is required by law. It requires television stations that they are responsible for their advertising otherwise. A television station or radio station can't run an ad if it knows it's fraudulent. And they actually, believe it or not, reject ads sometimes. It's why you don't see the crap you get in your email on TV ads, some of that Nigerian stuff. It's because TV stations can't run them. They're liable if they do. And the FCC, by law, says it used to say it will take away your license if you run ads without checking and running bogus ads. That's something you can't do. So in the last election, with the rise of third-party money, the vast majority of ads are not coming from candidates anymore. They're coming from these anonymous third-party groups, dark money. All those ads should have been inspected by TV stations. By law, the FCC should have been on the case of each of those stations. And the FCC took 3 sleeping pills and went to bed. It did nothing. And that was just, this is the books. This is simply there. They didn't do their job.
Well, continuing on the FCC, because I just got a text message from Obama.
No, you might have.
As you know, he's saying there's a vacancy at the top of the commission now. Who should I appoint, he asks, and what should be the top priorities of the FCC?
Well, I was thinking it's somebody named Barsamian. But no, look. The appointment to head the FCC is a big deal. And, the funny thing about it is that our regulatory agencies have been so diminished. I was at an event with Russ Feingold a couple weeks ago, a Common Cause event, where he said the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, is essentially non-existent, right? It's become a dysfunctional agency. The FCC we think of as somewhat more existent, but still one that is profoundly disappointing in so many ways. And part of why our regulatory agencies have become so disappointing is because they seem to be pure extensions of the presidents who are in power, right? They're pure extensions of whoever's there, rather than an independent agency seeking to do things that should be done. And so our advocacy as regards the next head of the FCC should be, in my view, for somebody who really is independent, somebody who is independent of the interest groups that are, and the institutions that are influenced by the FCC. You want the FCC to be a public interest agency. And so it unsettles me that there is a lot of discussion about, that maybe somebody should head it who has a background, in representing some industry or, the telephone industry or something like that. There really are terrific people out there who care about these issues, who've been highly involved in them. Some people talk about Susan Crawford, who's written a book on some of these issues and has a great deal of experience, who haven't become industry representatives. And one of the reasons so many of us, I think, were excited about Michael Kopps's service on the FCC, and he served for a decade, was that Michael Kopps, fascinatingly enough, did not serve as sort of somebody who you could always predict where he was going to go. This is an important thing to understand. Media reformers have a great affection for Michael Kopps, because he stood up so strongly on media consolidation issues and stuff like that. But there are some folks who didn't like him so much because he actually had some real concerns about what he considered to be inappropriate content in media, and particularly concerns as regards children and what they might see. And so the fact of the matter is that he was not a cookie-cutter player. And he took stands on issues, and he built coalitions, and sometimes those coalitions crossed right to left, Democrat to Republican. And I would just say that as we advocate, and I think we should advocate for the right picks as regards the FCC, that your goal is to have somebody on there who honestly thinks that their job, even if I might disagree with them on a particular issue, that their job is to represent and defend and advocate for the public interest. And a part of that public interest is to assure that American democracy is sustained by a journalism and a media that is encouraging of our participation in this process, not discouraging of it.
The president must be tuning in or watching the live cast, because he says to your comments, "Thanks very much, I really appreciate what you have to say, but the people need to make me do it."
Franklin Roosevelt texted that.
There's some younger people here, and here's a question, Bob. What do student journalists need to do to navigate this very shaky environment?
Well, don't give up, whatever you do. It's hard. Being a journalist now is like being an actor or an actress. It's you have to have a day job oftentimes to work on your craft. And it wasn't that way until 10 years ago. But whatever you don't give up, we need you, and force us as a society and work with us to force us to create institutions and structures so you will have gainful employment, because we can't survive without you. So the most important thing is do not give up. And then get involved in the politics of this, because it's crucial. You have to fight for your own survival and get involved. And you're here, so if you're here, you understand that. But the market's not going to solve our problems. That's clear. It'll solve some problems, perhaps, but it's not going to solve this problem. And so I'll just leave it there because we got a lot of other questions. But don't give up.
I'll very quickly say that there are young journalists right now who are doing groundbreaking work, and they're finding ways to do it. Often they are creating their own systems of financing. I was talking to a journalist who has a website where she asks people to support her journalism, and she's actually getting a little bit of support there. And that's encouraging, and that is not a bad thing. That is a decent model. But at the end of the day, we have to make sure that young people have ways in and ways to establish themselves. And in Death and Life of American Journalism, we write about the idea of creating I want to make sure we have the right term here, a journalism, a news corps, so to speak.
Yeah, but we don't want to confuse it with News Corp.
No, not that. No. But an AmeriCorps type model for young people who want to go into journalism so that they can cover undercovered communities. And just as AmeriCorps took people out and got them involved in all sorts of volunteer, what would traditionally have been volunteer activities, but they got a little bit of pay, a little bit of support to do it. We think it's a very vital notion to come up with a journalism corps, to say that young people who want to commit a year to go in and cover a community ought to get some support, some sustenance in doing that. And we think that's a way for a lot of young journalists to kind of leap that first barrier, maybe establish a reputation covering a neighborhood, covering a community, and then perhaps getting across that line to a job.
Plus, communities might get coverage that aren't being covered now at all. Yeah.
What do you envision for the role of the internet in reaching voters? And what do you think of online voting?
Ooh. John, I'll let you have that one.
Well, we just were talking about how you're going to go into people's phones and do all sorts of stuff, right? And then it's like, look, online voting is something that may happen eventually, but there's an immense amount of distrust of it, and that distrust is rooted in concerns about the hacking of websites, and we have websites of major political players and of major media outlets that get hacked. And so I think that before we rush into online voting, I think we have to think about whether you have the genuine security to make it work. I also would point out, though, that as regards using this power to communicate ideas and communicate information, there are a lot of experiments, and as seeking to get the will of the people, seeking to learn more about where people are at via online models. And those are exciting, and we shouldn't be purely dismissive of them just because we fear hacking or whatever. We should be open to experiments that seek to make the democratic process work better. Because one of the things in this country, whether it's online voting or I would prefer a whole lot of different models, but one of the things that's very important is in a lot of America, it's pretty hard to vote. It's surprisingly hard to cast a ballot. We do it on Tuesday. A working day. We make people travel, sometimes remarkable distances, to do it. They often have to, produce, proof that their grandmother was born in Rhode Island, and all sorts of other things. And at some fundamental level, our goal as people who want to have a functional democracy ought to be to make voting very, very easy, reliable, safe, easy, and it can be done. Other countries are much more committed to this. And the one thing, I shouldn't say much more committed, other countries have done, I think, better work on this regard. And Jimmy Carter has a very good point. What he says is most countries, when he decides whether he's going to monitor an election, they have a national election commission that sets basic standards for voting for the entire country. There's, you don't have different rules for voting in one province or one region versus another. And I think that would be a very good place for the United States to start looking at this. I mean, it is startling to me that, in one state, you can go and vote on election day and just, show a little bit of proof that you're from there or wherever. And in other states, you got to register a month in advance and you have to go through all kinds of hoops. I mean, these are different voting systems, and I don't know how you create a full national result when you have that much disparity in how we vote.
And that's layered in with this anachronistic electoral college, which is hugely anti-democratic. Right. A lot of interest.
Loser can win.
Yeah, and has on a number of occasions. A lot of interest in this whole issue of voting and democracy. Is there an organization for the guarantee of the right to vote? And second question, what about the idea that our dollars are votes? How can we spend our money to vote for the world we want to see?
There you go. Let me do quick the first part, and I'll let Bob answer the great question. Are there organizations that deal with this? There's actually a group called Fair Vote, which is the old Center for Voting and Democracy. And they have advocated on this for a long time. And they're quite a remarkable group. And I just would recommend go to Fair Vote's website, take a look at it, and you'll see that they have a lot of models for making American democracy work well.
Well, yeah, just outside of politics, I mean, I assume the question isn't about how you buy politicians or place ads, but rather how you use your own money to support institutions you want to prosper, just sort of separate from what we've been talking about. Well, support those businesses in your community as much as you can, small businesses, cooperatives, they're part of your community. Do the best you can. Now, that's not always that easy to do, because there's been such a monopolization in so many areas of retail in this country now. It's much more difficult than it would have been 30 or 40 years ago. But yeah, I mean, I think that I don't have to, there's better things for me to talk about than that.
From an alternative radio staffer, should public media stop taking so much corporate dollars?
Yes, absolutely. And I think, we have to have a public broadcasting system. There should be no advertising, no enhanced underwriting, no corporate support. And, well, in fairness to those systems, it's a function of their poverty that they turn to that. I mean, I think if they were given the choice, you can get the sort of funding that other advanced countries have for your public broadcasting, and you'll have to forego those absurd enhanced underwriting ads. They'd say, great, yeah, where do we sign? So, we have to then support them. If we want to be able to get rid of it, let's fork out some money.
You might know that the University of Colorado at Boulder has closed its journalism department.
I'm well aware of that. I have a friend who teaches
Yeah, and
there.
here's a question. Is not the problem with journalism schools?
Mm-hmm. Oh, is that the problem in journalism schools?
The problem?
The problem journalism schools the problem.
Well,
let me take a shot at this,
sure,
Bob. Look, as somebody who doesn't teach in a journalism school, I think journalism is a craft, not an art, and I think that we often learn best how to practice it by doing it. And I started writing for weekly newspapers when I was 11 years old, and violating some child labor laws, I think. And but I think that journalism schools have a role. What I find challenging and what does trouble me is that a growing number of journalism schools are kind of creating these concentrated I don't know, what is it, you call it courses of study, where you learn some journalism, you learn some public relations, you learn some advertising. And I understand that they're trying to help people find a job, but I was raised to believe that the public relations folks weren't necessarily your allies if you're trying to do journalism. And so I would hope that young journalists are trained to have that skepticism as regards public relations, rather than kind of set where they're given the message, look, if it doesn't work out in journalism, you can go over and try and convince journalists of things. I think there's some challenges.
I think there's a political question here that's important, which is journalism schools have been educated. There are hundreds of them in the country, not just Colorado, but lots of smaller schools have them. And most journalists have gone through journalism programs, undergraduate programs, most working journalists in the country, or graduate programs like John did. And they have a very important role to play. They do have influence, not as much as I'd like. And unfortunately, most of them have been, like Rip Van Winkle for the last 20 years, completely asleep by the collapse of their field. and unaware of it until it was too late. And they've been so tied up in the idea that the fate of the field is tied up in the fate of the media owners and the fate, how well they can do. They have not been able to take advantage of what is a position. They should have been forcefully leading the fight, saying we need journalism, we've got to fight for it, this is something we've got to stand for and get policies to create it and use our resources to encourage it. And I'm glad to say some journalism schools are doing that. I'm glad to say there are a handful, and I think to some extent your alma mater, Columbia, is doing this. And there's a handful of others that are really understand that the market's not solving it. If we're going to have journalism, it's not just about blogs. It's about really trying to cultivate institutions, and that it's a serious political fight. So I think journalism schools have a huge role to play. Most of them aren't playing it yet, but we need to get them in the game. We shouldn't be shutting them down.
No.
We've been talking for almost an hour and a half. Days seems longer. The word class hasn't come up. What role does class play in these issues?
Well, pretty big one. Look, one of the great challenges in America is, and this cuts in a lot of different ways. It used to be that journalism wasn't necessarily a respectable craft. And an awful lot of people who went into it came from the places they covered. And that was certainly true when I was a kid. But increasingly, journalism, because we have made it harder to get in, right? Because there are fewer jobs and they are much harder to get, we have tended to make it, in some ways, more of an elite field, right? There are fewer people doing it at very elite levels. And so it is much harder for working class folks to become journalists today, I think, in many, many ways. You can certainly become a blogger, but if you want to make a living, it becomes more challenging. And that's one element of it. The flip side is on what gets covered. And I cannot emphasize to you the extent to which the coverage of low-income communities, of working-class communities in this country has been dramatically diminished in recent decades. It has just, I know some people think of this as a joke, but it isn't at all. In the 1960s, you had a lot of television shows about working-class people, right? People who ran salvage yards and, like grocery stores and things like that. And now we have television shows about, like rich people who do cool things. And I would suggest that an awful lot of our news is about rich people who do cool things rather than the broad mass of working people in this country. Labor coverage has been dramatically diminished in this country. And the reason we should worry about that is because when you stop covering something, people stop seeing it as an option. And so if you don't cover labor unions as a serious presence in this country, as something that does something, to my mind, very, very valuable, people don't see labor unions as something that they might opt for as a vehicle to advance their ideals, to advance their goals. And so I think there is a tremendous gap as regards our coverage, particularly of working class communities, working class issues, and I think it has a profound impact on our journalism and on our country.
And this the other side of the coin of that is this book is in effect a class analysis. I mean, it's talking about the power of the, not that book, but you could waive that one. But
a fine holiday gift.
No, the Dollarocracy book that we wrote is about the power of those with lots of money, the extraordinarily wealthy, to dominate at the expense of everyone else, and that's class.
Bob, do you think that objectivity, either as an ideal or as a method, has a role in media reform?
In reform, or in, let me rephrase that question. Okay. Does it have a role in journalism? I think it's a better way to deal with it. And yes, I think absolutely. I'm not I don't think it's possible, but I think we want a range of media, and I think it's not bad to have some media that are trying their darndest to get it accurate, and they might not have a particular view on the subject. I think great journalism will have a view on the subject and try to get it accurate too. You need a range of things, but I think that but for someone to claim I'm completely objective, there's no values here, is preposterous. But if you say, look, I have a value, but I'm trying to get the facts here as straight as possible, and I'm accountable for them. So if you see I've got a problem, I will answer to it, or I will change my analysis. I'll be honest about it. If that's an objectivity, I'm for it. If that's good enough. But the notion of pure objectivity is, of course, preposterous. But I don't think anyone makes that claim anymore.
At the risk of sounding like a relativist, I will suggest that there are many kinds of objectivity, and that I find in many opinion journals a great deal of objective journalism. And I've always been a big reader of National Review, William F. Buckley's publication. And at many times in the history of this country, National Review has called out the conservative movement for being too extreme or for going to places that it shouldn't go. And even in the current moment, in the aftermath of the 2012 election, I've read conservative media that has had quite thoughtful analyses of what is amiss with the Republican Party, and it isn't all silliness. There's some very sound coverage there. So I think that you can have objectivity in an opinionated media, but the thing that troubles me is people who say, I am completely objective. I have I'm a blank slate. I go and look at these stories, and I just tell you what I see. Invariably, that person is telling you that they have such a finely tuned moral sense that whatever they approach, however they come off it, is going to be the absolute truth. And I just don't buy that. I much prefer somebody who says, look, I've got some opinions, I've got biases, I grew up a certain way, I know certain things, I'm going to try to be fair, but at the end of the day, those things are going to affect me.
There appears to be a split in radical media communities about this whole notion of government-subsidized journalism. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we aren't going to have journalism without government subsidies. The key question is, can we have them so there's no government control over the content? And that's the crucial thing. That's where the policy debate in the study has to be. It can be done. And if it can't be done, we might as well just fold up the tent, guys, because nothing's happening. There's not going to happen otherwise. It sure can be. Look, we see in the United States, we have publicly funded universities. I teach at one of them. Now, some of you might have gathered that the Dollarcrats of Illinois probably aren't really wild about paying my salary. But you know what? Look what I write. Look what I teach. They don't affect me. It's publicly funded. They've set up firewalls to protect what I do and what other faculty do from big shots coming in or politicians coming in and getting me fired and locked up. You can do those things. Other countries have demonstrated how that can be done. Our own history with postal subsidies shows how you can set up effective government subsidies that do not allow any government control over the content and that encourage diversity of views. This is just, if we can't do that, we can't engage in self-government. We can't control ourselves, even to govern ourselves socially. I think that's preposterous on its face.
Well, as people leave this gathering today, should they go out and look for the nearest ledge to jump off of?
No.
No,
How
optimists.
about some concrete suggestions?
Well, far from looking out for the nearest ledge to jump from. What I would suggest is this. Most people want to imagine they live in the worst of all times. We really do. It's a bizarre thing. It's just like we say, that snowstorm was the worst snowstorm ever, but I made it through. It's like we like to, somehow it reinforces our sense of our strength and our rugged individualism to think that, these are really awful times. But the fact of the matter is, America has throughout its history had incredibly rough and incredibly challenging moments. And in those incredibly rough, incredibly challenging moments, the mid to late 1850s, when we wrestled with the question of human bondage and what we would do about it, the late 19th century, the 1890s into the early 1900s, when we wrestled with the question of economic bondage, what would we do about it? Would we continue to be a country where our children were sent into dangerous factories to work? The early 1960s, where we wrestled with the question of how a country that said all men are created equal could have a poll tax. Again and again throughout our history, we have wrestled with really hard, lingering problems, and they have come to a crisis point, and we have decided at that time not to respond casually, not to respond with tinkering, but to respond with an age of reform that says we are going to solve each of the problems and each of the challenges because we believe this whole thing can work. And I would suggest that the frustrations, the anger, the resentment some of us feel as regards problems in our political process today are exactly what we need, because we need to be angry enough, passionate enough to go out and seek a new age of reform. And I'll tell you one final thing, that I was at a Watergate conference a couple of weeks ago, And I was talking to people around in the Watergate era, reformers from that era who tried to, clean up money in politics and other stuff. And I said, how much activism did you have across the country to really do something? Were they passing resolutions at town meetings? Were state legislatures acting on things and stuff? And they said, well, there was some of that, but not as much as you'd think. And I said, well, you know what's happening right now? In every state across this country, in hundreds and hundreds of communities, they are passing resolutions calling for the amendment of the Constitution of the United States to get big money out of our politics, to move to amend our Constitution. 11 state legislatures have acted on this issue, calling for a constitutional amendment to address the challenge of corporate money in our politics. The fact of the matter is, these are not jump off the ledge times. These are incredible times of activism. 10 years ago, we didn't have a national conference on media reform where hundreds of people gathered in a room like this to talk about these issues. We are actually in a time of progress. We're looking for ways to address that. It is challenging because there are pressures on the other side. But what I would suggest to you is we have everything in our grasp that reformers of the 1850s or the 1890s or the 1960s had, and we ought to seize that power and go out and make this country what it ought to be.
For some of your independent audio needs, go to alternativeradio.org. For those of you who live in the Denver Boulder area, tune into KGNU 1390 AM, 88.5 FM. And if you live in this area, Noam Chomsky will be here on May 7th. Let's give a warm round of applause to Bob McChesney and John Nichols. Thank you very much.